Mark Carney does seem to be wanting to maybe possibly interfere in the US midterms by waging this trade war at this exact moment, and it seems like it might have been further planned than many want to believe.
Liberal, 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 happy fun, la la la.
And before we kind of get into this, one thing I'll say here is this is foreign interference by the Canadian government. It's very obvious at this point, and we're going to kind of lay this out bit by bit.
Marzali says, quote, major breaking, Breitbart exposes the Democrat network in Carney's government. Maya Johnson, and we have been talking about this as well, COO of the Prime Minister's office, first person to ever hold the title, American, Hillary Clinton's director of scheduling in 2016, Biden campaign strategic consultant, also serves as senior special advisor for, quote, U.S. stakeholder strategy. John Podesta facilitated a private meeting between Carney, Barack Obama, and George Soros at Obama's May 2026 Toronto speech. The Nova Scotia meetings weeks later with Industry Minister Melanie Joly, George Soros, his wife, Frank McKenna, the chair of Brookfield. Carney built a Democrat war room inside the Canadian Prime Minister's office and negotiated with a Republican president. The result is exactly what you'd expect.
Yeah, it looks like the Democrats are running a full-on campaign for the midterms through Canada and Mark Carney here. It's not just the individuals being hired into the PMO office that used to work for Hillary Clinton. There's quite a few hirings being made, and there's a ton of advisors coming up to Canada right now to advise Mark Carney, and they're all associated with the Democratic Party. And that's only the first level of concern. Then you have the globalists in the EU also wanting Trump out, trying to weaponize Canada for that means. And then you have China giving out statements again. They love the Canadian strategy of weaponizing Canada against the United States.
Breitbart says, quote, Democrats appear to be colluding with Canada's anti-Trump government. And could that also be because a lot of the war machine that the Democrats had in USAID and a lot of that money handling has been fully now cut off?
Well, that's the thing. Trump cut off USAID money. They're having a real struggle. Maybe a lot of that money is being laundered into Canada where they can't get their hands or eyes on it, so they don't know what's happening. And that's why they have the strategists in Canada creating a war room for the midterm elections.
And we're not the only people noticing this. CBC Watcher says, quote, CBC's David Common says a quiet part out loud, saying, quote, look at this map of Trump swing states. Darker colors mean more Canadian tariff pain. Michigan, Iowa, Ohio, and Maine, perfect for flipping those closed Senate races and deciding Trump's control of Washington.
Well, and this is crazy. When the mainstream media is talking about this, they're literally talking about foreign interference. And then it's the Canadian government that wants to claim foreign interference in the Alberta independence movement, which is absolutely ridiculous, especially with the level of transparency the Alberta independence movement has had with every single dollar.
Map out a lot about where that pressure is coming from. Take a look at the map that shows which states are facing an outsized impact. Look, for instance, at Michigan or Iowa. The darker the color, the more the impact. And these are two states in particular where Senate races in those midterm elections are very, very close, where Trump's control over Washington will ultimately be decided by those November midterms. Let's drill down into the states themselves. Iowa, we do a lot of farm machinery trade with Iowa. Total value $6.5 billion. This impacts about close to 10% of the trade. If we move on to our next state.
And pause it for a moment. They're literally talking about how we can interfere in the American elections, how Canada is going to have an impact because of this tariff war. This is absolutely ridiculous at this point. If it was the opposite way around.
But that's absolutely obvious.
Are looking at Texas, big state. Not a huge percentage, but a very large value. And of course, plastics as well as fossil fuels, generally a big part of Canada's trade. Let's move on now to Maine. Lobster goes there for processing, or rather comes to Canada for processing. And so it is a major percentage of the impact. And counter tariffs appear to be meant to weaken the Republicans' tentative hold on the Senate seat there. Let's turn to Michigan, border state closely tied to Canada.
Did you say tariffs are meant to weaken them in Maine so they can lose a seat?
Industry to the integrated auto industry, again, significant percentage. Trump's tariffs already costing U.S. automakers billions of dollars. Canada's retaliation will add to that. Lastly, let's look at Ohio. It is a key swing state. Trump promises to use tariffs to bring back steel and heavy industry jobs. He claims it is key to his hold on the state. Canada targeting that. Speaking of Ohio, let's bring in Marianne, who's been looking much more closely at some of the political implications of what can be a bellwether in U.S. political circles.
Yeah, so to really drive home this message that for Ohio, Canada is its largest international trade partner. exporting billions of goods north of the border, as you noted, particularly when it comes to manufacturing and even agriculture. But with the midterm elections just coming up, they are potentially going to see a sway in votes because the tariffs are a huge issue there, particularly for those workers in those industrial areas. To give everyone a sense of background, this is a red state. It is traditionally a Republican stronghold. President Trump won there for the last 3 elections. Its governor and senators, all Republican. But the hope for the Democrats is that as workers there start to feel that pain when it comes to the prices and the job impact there, as they start to feel really the effects.
And pause it just for a second. What's going to happen if the Americans get their elbows up and they really want to hollow out Canada at this point? So far, this is simply a business deal. It's a fly to the Americans. But what happens if Donald Trump wins the midterms? He has about $1 billion to spend. The polls, I think, even though they say they favor the Democrats, a lot of those polls are actually paid for by the Democrats. And we've seen what happened in 2024. It was too big to rig.
As counter tariffs, they could tap into that, potentially flip the state.
I mean, as you know, Ohio's so critical to the auto industry. Trump has been quite popular among some in the state in saying, no, we're going to bring all that auto manufacturing back into the United States. But generally, now that there are tariffs, reciprocal tariffs, the threat of reciprocal tariffs, where do things stand for Ohio?
My God. I mean, this is a clip that the Americans need to watch and understand. Canada is really starting to become a threat. They're starting to interfere, not only in the midterms, but if they're willing to do this in the midterms, I can only imagine they have something up their sleeve for the 2028 election with J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio.
But speaking of J.D. Vance, interestingly enough, we have seen him campaigning on this in Maine, for example, doing speeches about how Canada's new trade war and elbows up strategy does affect them and explaining how it affects the workers of Maine. And I'm guessing they're going to be going to a lot of these other states to fully explain what was being done by Canada, how Canada had been taking advantage of a lot of the workers in those states specifically, and why, while there's a short amount of pain and the short term, maybe in the long term, being able to bring back a lot of that industry, being able to not be reliant on that trade with Canada if Canada is going to be putting its elbows up for a long time, might be best.
Well, and this is, I think, a dirty little secret as well. The Canadians don't want the Americans to know. In the short term, there may be a little bit of pain, not very much, but in the long term, a lot of those industries are going to be hollowed out and moved to those northern states. And there's going to be a massive boom if this trade war continues for a long time.
And as Canada and Carney have continuously said that they want to get closer and closer and build a better relationship, not just with China, which might have been a big sticking point in this trade war that now Canada is waging, but also with the EU, and saying that they want to partner, maybe even enter the EU, which might explain why there's so much focus now and continues to be so much focus on the European Union. Arpan Khanna says, quote, Carney says Canada is at quote unquote war. Then why is he addressing Europe's parliament and not Canada's? Canadians deserve answers from their prime minister. Recall Canada's parliament. And also, we haven't seen, once again, I've been saying it, we haven't seen a transparent version of why the trade talks broke down from the Canadian side. Some things have been coming out from the US side. A lot of things have been coming out from the US-Mexico talks, but nothing really from what happened really during the informal trade talks.
Well, I think the EU is looking at this as an opportunity to hurt Trump in the midterms. And if it works, they want to probably implement a similar strategy in 2028. We know how Trump has really pushed the globalists to the absolute brink. And if we can follow it up with the J.D. Vance and the Marco Rubio in 2028, that's going to be it for their globalist utopia dream. They're looking at this as a way to kind of push back on Trump, I think, and they're using Carney and the Canadian people as that leverage.
Yes, says Carney, to address European Parliament and attend the State of the Union address. Because that makes the most sense right now, to leave Canada as you actually are leaving Canada at war almost by itself. But next, Rebel News also says Chinese state media praises Carney's, quote, Chinese-styled counterattack against Trump. And we have been talking about how it was just China and Canada that were the only ones that were trying to fight and wage war against Trump's tariffs. The state-run media outlet portrayed the comparison as a compliment, arguing Carney's actions demonstrate the necessity and legitimacy of China's own retaliatory approach to the Trump administration.
Trump has the globalist, has China, has everybody on their back foot right now. And I think both China, the EU, the Democrats in the United States are a little bit dazed and confused. And they're looking at Canada as this is this is a potential way to sacrifice a pawn, being Canada, in order to get a little leverage in the midterms, which is absolutely ridiculous, because ultimately, who does it hurt the most? It doesn't hurt Mark Carney because he's completely invested in the United States, 91% of his assets. It hurts the Canadian people, and especially the Canadian working class.
And also, let's not forget that Canada has been praising and very blatant and blunt about their strategic partnership and how they're getting closer to China, and how that might be one of the sticking points as to why the trade talks broke down. The inability of Canada to say, okay, we'll backtrack a little bit on this strategic partnership that we thought was a great idea. Canada also not coming out great, even with trade with China, because some tariffs were imposed after they announced this strategic partnership. But Mexico, on the other hand, being the mirror to Canada during these trade talk negotiations with the US, going into official formal negotiations, but also being able to get rid of a lot of the Chinese investment in China talk that was being had during those meetings. And lastly, Eric Doherty says, quote, Scott Bessent is just staring into Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney for trying to screw over America.
Yeah, and this is fantastic to see, because everything the EU is doing through Canada, China is doing through Canada, heck, even the Democrats are using Canada against the United States for the midterms right now. They see right through it, and the statement from Scott Bessent is kind of a tell to that. Trump is going to enact vengeance after those midterms, I believe, and it's going to really, really hurt Canada at that point.
On Canada to become a state. He did say that they're getting all the benefits of being a state without being one.
I think he would like Canada to come to the table and negotiate in good faith. They were offered quite a good deal last week. They chose to reject it. Unfortunately, Prime Minister Carney rose to power on an anti-American, anti-Trump platform. I believe he was more than 20 points behind. And he seems to have gone back to his old playbook. And I think one has to ask oneself, is he trying to benefit himself, the Liberal Party, or the Canadian people? Because they were offered a very good job. So
what he's saying there is definitely a tell. They know what's up. And the best deal Canada could have got was before the midterms. That would have given a little bump to the economy. I don't think a big bump, but a little bump. And that would have helped. Now that they did this so publicly, it's basically a slap in the face to the Americans and Trump. After these midterms, I fully expect a bilateral trade deal with Mexico, and possibly for the announcement of the cancellation of the USMCA, which that means the clock is ticking. You have 6 months after that point, and Canada is going to have to come to the table then, and they're going to have virtually no leverage at that point.
Exactly. And however, Canada might be being used as a pawn and as the leverage between a larger, broader war between the middling powers, or the middle powers, as Carney likes to call them, and the US, in a way to basically attack the US, especially as this is coming right before the midterms and might actually hurt a lot of things. But don't forget to subscribe. Again, it really does help us out. And also like the video. Thank you so much.